My parents were always ashamed of me, laughed at my dreams, and told me I was incapable of anything. I grew up in this shame and humiliation until I started earning $800,000 a month. At that point, their attitude changed. They wanted to appear proud of me and take credit for my success. But I plotted a revenge that completely shattered their traditional power and forced them to admit their mistakes. Now they depend on me and understand that they will never again be able to control my life. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. Hi, my name is Michael and I'm 29 years old. I was born and raised in a small town in Ohio. My family was never poor, but we weren't exactly rich either. My father was an engineer, and my mother taught math at school. I never had problems with food, clothing, or shelter, but from childhood, I felt like my parents never took me seriously. They always had their own vision of what their son should be, and that vision didn't align with my reality. I was never an excellent student at school. I was interested in computers and the internet, but my parents thought it was a waste of time. They constantly compared me to their friends' children, who had gone to prestigious universities, won Olympiads, and received awards. Every time we had guests, I felt like an outsider in my own home. My mother would openly tell everyone that I was lazy and lacked ambition. My father said I would never amount to anything. I got used to these jabs, but inside I always felt a burning feeling that I wasn't worthy of their approval. When it came time to apply to college, I applied but failed several exams and ended up going to an inexpensive local college. My parents were disappointed and didn't hesitate to say so. I remember my mother telling me they were embarrassed in front of the neighbors for their son attending a passable college instead of Harvard or at least the University of Michigan. These words hit me hard, but I didn't respond. In college, I continued to be interested in computers, programming, and online business. I started trying to make money online. At first, it was pennies, some random projects, but I believed I could achieve more. My parents, however, thought it was frivolous and insisted I was wasting my life. At some point, my father declared that he was no longer going to pay for my education unless I got my act together. I had to get a job in a store to pay my bills. It was hard, but that's when I realized I could only rely on myself. Gradually, I began to understand online business. I tried reselling products, creating websites, and advertising. I made hundreds of mistakes, lost my last money, but I didn't give up. During this time, my parents became increasingly distant from me. We barely spoke. They looked at me as a loser, a 23-year-old living in a small rented apartment and working evenings to make ends meet. I knew I was an embarrassment to them. The turning point came when I found a direction that actually started to bring in profits. I created an internet marketing agency that helped companies in the US promote their products online. At first, I managed the projects myself, then I started hearing people. The business grew faster than I expected. After 2 years, my income reached $50,000 a month. But even then, my parents didn't believe in me. They thought it was temporary, that the internet was frivolous and unreliable. They kept saying I'd wasted my years. Everything changed last year. Thanks to several big contracts, my income skyrocketed. Now I earn around $800,000 a month. I own a house in Miami, several cars. I travel the world and don't deny myself anything. And that's when my parents started showing an interest in me. They started calling more often, asking how I was doing. Suddenly, they started boasting about me in front of the neighbors, telling me that their son was a successful businessman. I saw how their attitude changed dramatically. As a child, they were ashamed of me, withdrawn, humiliated me in front of others. And now that I'm rich, they smile at me and pretend they always believed in me. But I remember it all perfectly. I remember every phrase they said, every look of disappointment. And I'm not going to just let it go. Money can't erase years of humiliation. Now I'm going to show them that my life is mine alone. They'll be forced to see the difference between how they treated me before and how they're trying to treat me now. I decided it was time to set the record straight. A few months after my business began bringing in a steady income, I decided to visit my parents in my hometown. I hadn't been there in a long time, and frankly, I had no desire to return to those walls where I felt like a stranger. But I was still overcome with curiosity, how they lived now and how they would react to seeing me after so many changes. I boarded a plane and found myself in Ohio a couple of hours later. The city greeted me the same way it always did. Gray streets, familiar shops, the same smell I remembered from childhood. Only now I looked at it all differently. I had come not as the boy they considered a loser, but as a person capable of affording any life. As I pulled up to my parents' house in a rented car, I noticed that nothing had changed. The same peeling walls, the same yard that my father had never properly maintained. But when I walked inside, the first thing that struck me were the photographs. Pictures of me hung on the walls. Not childhood ones, of me as a teenager in old clothes, but fresh photos from social media, of me standing in an expensive suit, of me in front of a yacht in Miami, of me smiling with colleagues from the agency. I stopped and looked at it with some incomprehension. Just a few years ago, my parents had been ashamed of me, unwilling even to discuss my life. And now they were clearly demonstrating my success. Neighbors were already sitting in the living room, some familiar families. They were talking animatedly with my parents, and when I entered, all eyes turned to me. My father immediately stood up, straightened his shoulders, and loudly announced, "And here is our Michael, the very one we told you about." I felt the air in the room change. Everyone started smiling, saying hello, asking questions. My parents beamed as if I were their greatest achievement in life. I sat down at the table, and the conversations flowed one after another. Someone asked about business, someone about traveling, someone else about cars. I answered briefly, but I carefully observed how my parents behaved. My mother constantly interrupted me, adding stories that weren't true. She claimed that she was the one who told me I would be successful from childhood. She said she always supported my interest in computers, that it was thanks to her persistence that I got into college. I listened and felt anger boiling inside me. My father nodded, saying he always knew I had strength and intelligence. People at the table nodded and admired me, but I sat there and realized that my parents were taking credit for something they never did. At one point, one of the neighbors said, "You must be so proud of your son, you've invested so much in his development." And my mother, without batting an eye, nodded. "Yes, it wasn't easy, but we always believed in him." I barely kept from laughing out loud. Memories immediately flooded my mind. How my mother, in front of everyone in 10th grade, told me I was a disgrace to the family. How my father in college refused to help me and declared me a nobody. How they both laughed at my online business ideas, calling them nonsense. And now they sat in front of everyone, playing the role of loving parents who supposedly always had my back. I remained silent, but tension was building inside me. After dinner, the conversations continued in the living room. My father poured wine, my mother brought out dessert, and each time they emphasized how great I was and how lucky they were to have a son. The guests left closer to the night, and then the three of us were left alone. I sat in a chair and waited for them to speak in private. My mother spoke first. She smiled as if nothing had happened and asked, "So, son, did you like what we did? Everyone now knows how successful you are." My father added, "You have to understand, this is important to us. We always wanted people to know we had a worthy son." I looked at them and realized that for them, my life had never been about me, but about how they would appear to others. They cared about the opinions of their neighbors, status, respect. I was just a tool for this. I calmly told them I noticed how they told other people's stories on my behalf. They glanced at each other and tried to brush it off, saying I was taking it too seriously. But it hurt me more than I thought. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my old room, where nothing had changed in all these years, and thought about how my parents were trying to rewrite history. They portrayed themselves as caring, wise, and supportive, when in reality, they spent most of my life humiliating and ashamed. And now that I've become rich, they want to pass off my success as the result of their upbringing. I realized I couldn't let this go so easily. I decided I had to reveal the truth, not by yelling and arguing, but in a way that would make them feel for themselves how false their words sounded. The next morning, I told them I wanted to host a family dinner at a restaurant, but to invite not only the neighbors but also relatives we hadn't seen in a long time. They were delighted, thinking it would be another reason to brag. But I had a different plan. I arranged a meeting at a restaurant in the city center. My parents were delighted when I said I wanted to invite not only the neighbors, but also some relatives they hadn't seen in a long time. They immediately took it as an opportunity to once again show everyone what a great son they now had. For me, this was the perfect opportunity. I was going to play a completely different game. That evening, we gathered around a large table. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and even a few distant relatives I didn't quite remember came. My parents walked around the room with smiles, greeting the guests, telling them that I was now a business owner and that my life was like something out of a movie. I watched all this and felt them enjoying the attention. For them, every glance and every smile was confirmation of their importance. I sat and waited for the moment. Once everyone was seated and ordered food, conversations flowed naturally. People asked me about my business, my travels, how I got to this point. And then my mother began to interject her corrections again. She interrupted and said that she had seen talent in me even as a child, that she had always supported my interests, that it was she who insisted that I study computers. My father nodded and added that I grew up under his proper upbringing. I could see that the guests believed them. After all, it's easier that way. Everyone loves stories about wise parents who raised a successful son. But I knew the truth, and I decided it was time. I waited until the conversation died down and everyone looked at me. I said calmly, without unnecessary emotion, that I wanted to tell my story as it was. Everyone fell silent, and I began to speak. I told them about how I was never the best in school and how my parents were ashamed of it. I told them how they compared me to other kids, saying I was a disgrace to the family. I described how I was left without support in college, how my father refused to pay for my education, and how my mother laughed at my attempts to make money online. I spoke calmly, but every word was precise. I saw the faces of my relatives change. Some raised their eyebrows in surprise, others looked at my parents, trying to figure out if this was true. My mother tried to interrupt me, but I raised my hand and said I wanted to finish. I explained that my success was the result of my mistakes, my failures, and my work. That no one helped me, that on the contrary, more often than not, I had to prove myself useful. I emphasized that respect and faith were what I'd always lacked, and that it was precisely this lack of support that had driven me to work 3 times harder than others. Silence fell. I saw my parents sitting there, unsure of what to say. They clearly hadn't expected me to come clean so openly. Several aunts and uncles exchanged glances, and someone whispered in a neighbor's ear. One of my cousins said out loud, "But your parents always said they were proud of you." I looked at him and calmly replied that pride only came with money. Before that, there had only been shame and disappointment. The atmosphere at the table changed. People began to look at my parents differently. The smiles disappeared, leaving only awkwardness. My mother tried to justify herself, saying that they only meant well and were strict for my own good. But the words rang hollow. I didn't argue. I simply said I'd never forget how I felt in their house, being humiliated for my passions and dreams. And I added that my success was mine alone. I noticed my father's lips tighten and my mother's face turn away, as if trying to hide her hurt. But it wasn't hurt at themselves. It was hurt at me for tearing off their mask in front of everyone. The evening continued, but without the previous gaiety. Conversations became short and tense. People began to slowly disperse, and my parents remained silent almost the entire time. When the guests left, the 3 of us were left alone. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice was harsh. He said I had overdone it and made them look bad. I calmly replied that I had told only the truth, and if they were ashamed, it was not for my words but for their actions. My mother began to cry, accusing me of ingratitude. She said they had raised me, wasted their time and energy, and now I was wiping my feet on them. But I looked at her and realized there was no sincerity in her words. She wasn't hurting for me, but for their reputation. I pulled myself together and said I wasn't going to play a part in their performance anymore. I didn't have to be a window dressing for them to hide their mistakes. I'm leaving, and they need to understand. If they want to be a part of my life, they'll do it honestly and without lies. I left the restaurant and felt like I'd told it like it was for the first time in years. But inside, I felt like this was just the beginning. My parents weren't going to give in so easily. I knew their character. They'd always try to save face. And that meant there was more to come, perhaps even more brutal. My father called me early that morning, and I could tell right away from his tone that something was wrong. His voice was tense, even trembling a little. He started talking about money, about the debts he'd accumulated over the past few months, about how the house and car bills were becoming unaffordable. My mother added that she'd lost her job, and now they had to save on literally everything. I listened, but I wasn't in a hurry to respond. My head replayed all the past years, when they'd pushed me away, disbelieved in my ideas, and laughed at my attempts to build a business. Their request for help sounded like a challenge, but I knew this was the moment to show them the value of their words and actions. I agreed to meet and discuss the situation in person. That evening, I arrived at their house. I immediately felt the tension in the air. They tried to act casual, but my father's gaze darted between me and the documents he had placed on the table, as if he had no choice. I sat down and calmly asked them to tell me everything in detail. My mother began listing debts, bills, loans. She tried to add emotion to evoke pity in me, but I remained silent. I saw this as an attempt at manipulation, to pretend they were victims of circumstance and that I should come to their aid. I reminded them of the past, how they laughed at my ideas, how they said I was never capable of anything, how they took credit for my success, posing as proud parents. My mother fell silent, my father clenched his fists. I spoke calmly, without shouting, every word hit the mark. I explained that help would be provided, but on my terms, and that I would not be a convenient victim of their mistakes. They listened, and I saw something shift within them: fear, anger, helplessness. I proposed a plan. I was willing to cover some of the debts, pay for the education of their younger relatives, and help my mother with her job, but only if they admitted the truth about their past treatment of me. I emphasized that this was a condition for ending the lies and manipulation. My parents froze. My father tried to object, saying that it's too humiliating, that we won't tell these things in front of everyone, but I was adamant. I reminded them that I was no longer a boy they could intimidate and hide behind their stories. I was in control now, and the conditions would be as I set them. My mother cried, and my father remained silent. I saw their faces change, as they realized they had lost the power they were accustomed to over me. I gave them a few days to think about it and agree on the terms. After leaving home, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and tension. I knew I'd have to deal with their manipulation attempts and their habit of putting themselves above me more than once. But now everything was different. I saw their fear, and it gave me inner strength. The following week, I called and said I wanted to meet at my agency's office to discuss the details and sign the paperwork. The parents looked apprehensive, but agreed. When they entered the office, their eyes darted around the room, taking in the expensive equipment and furniture. I invited them to sit down and began a conversation. I made it clear that any money they received would be accompanied by documentation and reporting. I emphasized that the assistance wasn't a gift, but a condition for correcting their behavior and acknowledging their past. My mother tried to object, saying, "That's too strict, that surely it can be done without conditions." I calmly repeated that this was exactly how it would be, otherwise there would be no assistance. My father sat there, clenching his fists, and I could see he was struggling. I watched their habit of managing the situation crumble under my calm but firm gaze. We signed the documents, and I had them explain to neighbors and relatives that the assistance was provided on the condition of honesty and acknowledgement of the past. It was a difficult decision, but I understood. Otherwise, they would continue to live in the illusion that they were doing everything right and would use my name to gain status. My mother tried to hurt me at the last moment, saying I was cruel and that I couldn't be a son. I calmly replied that cruelty wasn't a refusal to tell the truth, but rather that their lies and pretense had been cruelty to me all these years. They fell silent. After they left, I was alone in the office, and for the first time in years, I felt the power they had over me shattered. They had gotten what they wanted: money, help, but now they understood that they could no longer manipulate me and hide their mistakes. I understood that there might be more attempts at pressure or attempts to reassert the old control ahead, but now I had experience and an inner sense of strength. And I knew that now that they were in my power and forced to acknowledge the past, I could build a relationship only on my terms, honestly and openly. I called my parents and set up a meeting in my office. This time, I wanted the terms to be strict and transparent, so that they would feel the dependence they had once tried to impose on me as a child through their attitudes and expectations. When they arrived, I met them in the hallway, maintaining a calm demeanor but sensing the tension building with every step they took. My mother looked worried. My father was holding back his irritation, but I saw fear in their eyes, something I'd long wanted to feel from them when they tried to control me. I invited them to sit in the conference room, and the first thing I did was place on the table the complete package of documents I'd prepared over the past few days. Inside were agreements, contracts, and terms of financial assistance that completely controlled their actions. Every payment, every expenditure, every purchase required my approval and transparent reporting. I explained that this assistance was provided only under strict conditions, ensuring honesty and sincerity in the relationship, and ensuring that they could never again use me as a tool for their own pride or status. My mother immediately began to protest, her voice trembling and her eyes filling with tears. She said it was humiliating and that she could not agree to such conditions. My father tried to intervene, claiming I was being too cruel and that they were not children to obey rules. I looked at them calmly and replied that it wasn't cruelty. Cruelty was the years of neglect, humiliation, and false pride they had inflicted on me since childhood. Now they were experiencing only a reflection of what I had felt then. I began to explain each condition, step by step, how they would report, how the money would be spent, which actions were only possible with my approval. My mother tried to interrupt, my father tried to threaten, saying they won't play by my rules, but I remained as calm as a rock. I watched them cringe as they read the conditions understandingly, realizing they had no choice. I added that any attempt to break the rules would automatically withdraw their support. It was cold but fair. At some point, my mother began to plead, promising to be good and not cause trouble, but I didn't give in. I saw the old self-assurance in her eyes and understood that pity was a tool of manipulation they had always used against me. Now it worked in reverse. I recounted every past humiliation, citing facts, dates, specific situations where they had taken credit for my successes and belittled my accomplishments. My father tried to protest that he only meant well, but I calmly reminded him that better was neither humiliation nor disdain. I saw him clench his fists and search for words, but could not find them. My mother trembled and tried to justify herself, but with each word, she only confirmed the truth of my allegations. Then I suggested that they maintain complete financial management under my control. Every bill, every expenditure would require my approval. Every month I would review reports, reconcile documents, and any attempts at circumvention would be punished by the termination of their assistance. I saw them begin to understand that they could no longer manage the situation as they had before. All their usual manipulations and attempts to present themselves as great parents have lost their power. I explained that this was a reflection of how they had treated me. Before, they controlled me. Now I controlled them, but not harshly, but legally, fairly, and precisely. My parents were silent, internally struggling with emotions, fear, shame, and helplessness. I gave them time to process this, telling them that the decision had to be conscious. In that moment, I felt my power and control finally becoming real. No shouting, no threats, only complete transparency and conditions they were forced to adhere to. This was revenge without violence, without humiliation in front of third parties, but much harsher than any scandal. They felt the dependence they had once tried to impose on me, and now their every move was under my scrutiny. I watched their reactions, seeing how the habit of control crumbled. Their self-confidence vanished, replaced by caution and a fear of making a mistake. My mother quietly said that she didn't think everything would be so strict, and my father nodded without saying a word. I realized this was the beginning of a new phase. Now they would act honestly or lose their support, and I was no longer a boy who could be intimidated or ignored. I suggested they leave their phones and laptops on the table to demonstrate transparency, and I said I would personally review all reports. Emotions swirled within me, not the joy of power, but the satisfaction that justice had been served. They had experienced the same dependence and constraint that I had felt years ago. It was a lesson they would never forget. I watched their faces as they adjusted to the new order, as they began to understand the value of their past words and actions. Their habit of concealing the truth, controlling me, and exploiting my success was broken. And I knew that there would be many more small tests ahead where they would be forced to comply, and each test a drop of revenge for years of humiliation, for false smiles and empty praise. I felt that revenge was finally taking a form that fully corresponded to the logic of history, justice, control, and a full reflection of their past actions. I saw that my parents understood this. Now I'm no longer a child, and their familiar world is crumbling under my calm but firm gaze. They will live with this knowledge, with this limitation, and with the understanding that after years of humiliation, it's my turn to control their lives, but to do so fairly and justly. And this feeling I experienced was incredibly powerful, not revenge in the sense of malice, but revenge as a restoration of the justice and power they once destroyed in my childhood. I invited my parents to another meeting, but this time it was not formal and friendly. I had prepared a plan in advance that would simultaneously help them with their problems and expose all their past falsehoods to people who might notice. My parents arrived unsure of what to expect, their eyes darting about, and I saw a mixture of hope and anxiety. I invited them to sit, but instead of the usual talk about helping, I began with questions that put them in an uncomfortable position. I asked if they remembered how they shamed me as a child, if they recalled the moments when they told me I was incapable of anything. My mother blushed, my father pursed his lips. I spoke calmly, without aggression, but every word was right on target. "Today we're going to do everything honestly," I said. "Everything you've ever hidden will be revealed. You'll get help, but you'll be in complete control, and now everyone around you will know the truth." I watched their confidence slowly fade. I explained that the help would be provided on the condition of public and complete transparency. All expenses, all spending, all actions would be under my control. I'd invited a few relatives they weren't expecting beforehand. They entered the room quietly, observing what was happening. My parents froze when they realized that now it wasn't just me watching, but other people who knew them as wise and proud parents would be witnesses. I began listing their past actions, giving specific examples. How they'd taken credit for my accomplishments, how they'd shamed me for my hobbies and dreams, how they'd pretended I was a loser in front of neighbors and relatives. I supported each example with evidence: letters, notes, an old diary, photographs. My parents tried to interrupt, make excuses, say they only meant well, but I didn't give them a chance. I saw the relatives' eyes widen in surprise, realizing they'd always perceived their parents as fair, when in reality, things were quite different. My mother was shaking. My father was trying to keep his back straight, but I could feel his habit of controlling the situation crumbling. I offered them a formal agreement: help with debts, bills paid, partial reimbursement of expenses, and assistance to relatives, but only with a full acknowledgement of the past and transparency in front of everyone invited. "Every payment will be visible, every expenditure monitored. Any attempt at manipulation, and you lose everything," I said calmly. I saw how this hit them harder than any argument. They realized that the familiar power was gone, that their habitual pride and falsehood were now transparent, and that they could no longer control the situation. I took another step of revenge. I offered the relatives who witnessed the meeting the right to ask any questions. And they began. "Is it true that you laughed at his hobbies? Did you help him when he was trying to make money?" My parents tried to respond, but every attempt at justification rang hollow because I had prepared the evidence. Their entire reputation was crumbling before my eyes, and I could see how embarrassed and frightened they were. Every question, every remark from my relatives was a small drop of revenge for years of humiliation and neglect. I watched them become flustered, their usual masks slipping. But I didn't stop there. I gave them the opportunity to sign a formal agreement on support and transparency, but added a clause requiring them to publicly share with their relatives and neighbors every month how I achieved my own success, without their corrections or taking credit. My parents fell silent. They understood this was a blow to their prestige, but they had no choice. Otherwise, there would be no help. I saw an internal struggle. Pride and fear intersected, and fear prevailed. It was a true moment of revenge. They were forced to admit to everyone that their past attitude toward me was false, and that all those years when they were ashamed of me, I had survived on my own, achieved success, and now controlled their lives. I watched their faces as their mother cried, not from pity, but from a sense of complete loss of control. My father tried to restrain himself, but I saw his habit of commanding and manipulating fade away. I gave them instructions on every financial transaction, every bill, every assistance they received. They tried to whisper, to look for loopholes, but every step was calculated, and I watched calmly. Their every breath, every attempt to justify themselves, it was a reflection of the years I suffered because of their behavior. They realized they could no longer play parent, no longer hide their falsehoods and control me. I gave them the opportunity to maintain at least some comfort, but only under my control, and that was my greatest weapon. A feeling of satisfaction boiled within me. It wasn't anger or cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was revenge in the form of justice and power. My parents experienced the dependence they had once tried to impose on me, but now in a mirror image, and the feeling of their confusion and helplessness was truly freezing. That evening, I was alone in the office, watching the aftermath of the meeting. My parents signed all the documents, confirmed their public acknowledgement of the past, and agreed to transparency, and I felt an incredible sense of control and closure. Revenge had reached its climax. They had received help, but it was in the form of punishment for their previous actions. They could no longer use me for their own pride, no longer pretend to be a public figure. I felt the balance of power had completely shifted. They were dependent on me, and I was free, and this feeling, simultaneously cold and satisfying, marked the end of my story. I knew there might be attempts at pressure ahead, but now they would be met with the law, documents, and my complete authority. Never again would they be able to repeat their past mistakes, and that was true revenge. A complete reflection of their behavior, fair and inevitable, and it would leave a permanent mark on their consciousness.